Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Cox. I am president of Oliver Group, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you here today. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you may be located. One of the things I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about, who Oliver Group is. When people ask us, what does Oliver Group do? And my response is typically, we reduce the risk and uncertainty of how organizations achieve their goals. And the way we do that is by changing how people perform, or maybe we don't. So the topic today, I think, is very relevant to, helping people perform at different levels. So what I'd like to do today from an agenda perspective is to walk through a few key concepts. The first is, what was the prompt for us having this webinar? Kind of set the stage. Talk a little bit about, when we think in the business world, what coaching is, and more importantly, what coaching is not. And then also give us a sense of a model that we can follow in helping people, that our friends, colleagues, direct reports, bosses even. How do we de-escalate in times of stress? How can we coach through and find another perspective and a way forward? Finally, then I want to also offer, some insights and some things we can think about how we can understand each other differently, and how that can inform and assist with our coaching process. One point I would like to make is that we are all coaches, or at least we all have the capacity to be coaches. And what prompted us coming together today was that we received a message, if you will, it was a text message from one of our clients, and they are in the healthcare industry. And the message was along the lines of stress. And that on the clinical side, this was in one of our clients that was in the early stages a few weeks ago. They were already seeing escalation in the COVID-19 cases. And with that escalation came conflict. And the conflict was on the clinical side. Some of the challenges they were having, you can imagine, were born out of the natural situation of fatigue, overwork, fear. There was lots of things going on. And so tensions were beginning to rise. So the opportunity then they were asking is there anything you could do to help us? Is there anything that you can do to help us understand the situation? How can we handle it differently? And we began talking internally, and we said, well, of course, let's talk through coaching. What is it? How can it help? And it's not just the healthcare field that's experiencing this. I'm sure that all of us, to some degree, are experiencing, stress, tension. We may be faced with layoffs, or family members who are facing that. There are economic ramifications. There are health ramifications. We're worried about our families. And I don't think there's any of us that are not affected by stress. And I think about all of our essential businesses and how they are taking care of us during this. And I can imagine the additional stress that they feel. So part of what we're going to do today is we're going to add in some polls, because I want to hear from you about some of the attributes or things we're going to talk about today, and get a sense of what you may be seeing or experiencing as we go through our conversation today. So the first poll I want to launch is around stress levels. I would like to hear from all of us, what is our current level of stress? So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, what is your current stress level? Okay, I'll go ahead and end polling. 76% reporting in. Let me share the results. Hopefully you can see the results. So interestingly enough, a bell curve. So some of us not that stressed, but if we look at, there are a number of us in the 7th and 8th or 70th and 80th percentile, many of us in the 50th percentile. I'm actually encouraged by that. That means that there are things that we are doing individually or collectively that are helping us manage stress and deal with the current situation. So thank you for that.
And that's why yellow.
So let's start with what coaching is and what it's not. I jumped ahead there a little bit, but let's go ahead and jump in.
And that's why yellow makes me sad, I think.
That's interesting. You know what makes me sad?
You do! Maybe we should chug on over to Mamby-Pamby land where maybe we can find some self-confidence for you, you jackwagon!
Tissue?
Okay, courtesy of our friends at Geico, many of us may remember that commercial. That one always stuck with me because while that's meant to be a therapy session, you know, the idea is that coaching is not therapy, good or bad. Therapy looks to the past. Therapy is about root causes. So coaching is not therapy. What else is coaching not? Well, it's not this, at least in the business context, right? If we think about the label of coach that we place on athletics, you know, the idea of the sideline ranting and the yelling and so forth that can often be associated with that role, the fact of the matter is while someone like Coach Saban is entrusted with the development and performance of his players, the fact of the matter is that he's more of a mentor or a teacher. He develops through telling, develops through teaching new ideas, new ways of doing things. Additionally, if we think about professors or teachers in our lives, they are also not coaches. You know, again, these are all teachers or mentors. It's a one-way delivery. We are receiving or listening in these cases, whether it's an athletics coach or a professor, we're receiving information. It's unidirectional often. So what is coaching? So I am a certified executive coach, ICF certified, and the International Coach Federation defines coaching as the thought-provoking, creative partnership process that inspires clients to maximize their personal potential. The International Coaching Conference takes it one step further, and I really like what they talk about, building awareness and empowering choice that leads to change. So when you think about unlocking a person's potential through coaching, the fact of the matter is that if we are good listeners and if we are asking good questions, we can sincerely change and help someone change how they're going to create an outcome. So let's talk a little bit more about that. One thing I'd like to ask you to participate in is another poll. I would like you to reflect on your role as a leader or as a teammate and think about how often do I ask questions versus how often do I direct? How often do I tell others when they come with me with a problem, am I giving them an answer, or am I, you know, in effect, am I, you know, helping them find their own answer? So I'm going to launch this new poll. So this poll is, what percentage of the time do you use good coaching when a colleague or direct report approaches you with a problem? Okay, looks like we've stalled out at 71% reporting. So I'm going to share the results. Again, not too surprising, a bell curve, with 70% of us, you know, feeling like it, or at least 70% of the time we're doing that. And there's some of us that feel pretty good. Maybe we are well trained, maybe we're conscious of that and effective leaders. And then, not surprising, you know, below 70% is pretty common. Because if you think about what we normally do in the business world, we are problem solvers. People come to us, they ask us to be engaged. We are paid to go find answers and implement change. So the question is, in stressful situations, when we're approaching each other, what can we think about differently in terms of the types of questions we ask and how we engage each other, rather than just trying to come up with an answer for someone? So I'll stop the share here. So based on that, this is where I want to get into the fact that we are all coaches. And what I'm going to talk a little bit right now is the GROW model. And the GROW model is a simple model that we teach in all of our leader development programming. The way I think about this is it is quite effective in situational coaching. So different from executive coaching, in which it could be a 30-minute or hour-long conversation that could span multiple months for some longer cycle development needs. This is quite effective situationally, and I will tell you can be used in a 360-degree format, and we'll get into more of that in just a minute. So GROW stands for Goal, Reality, Options, and Way Forward. And it's adapted from Max Landsberg's book, The Tao of Coaching. If you haven't picked it up, I recommend it. There's also a lot of great other tools in there, like the AID model for providing feedback. But what we've glommed onto at the Oliver Group is that the GROW model is highly effective, particularly in situational coaching. So let's go through each of the letters. The goal. It's very simple. Ask the person what outcome they would like to create. This is getting them focused on something different. Typically, a colleague or a subordinate, somebody approaches us and goes, I've got this problem, right? And our natural inclination may be to dive into problem solving versus helping them understand or step back and think about, well, what outcome? What would you want to see done differently? You know, if they're coming to you with a problem, generally they've been thinking about solutions. Our brains are wired to go into problem-solving mode. How do we best help them identify that future outcome? How do we best get them there versus us thinking that we have to have the answer? Because generally speaking, I don't know that I've been effective as a leader when I've given someone an answer that might work for me or a way out that might work for me, because that might not work for them. It might not fit their style. It might not even fit the situation appropriately. The next is reality. The idea here is to, if we've started talking about the goal, ask them to describe the reality of the situation. Now, a lot of people may come into our offices or approach us in the hallway or wherever it may be, and they may say, hey, you know, I'm having this problem and this and this and this, and they start describing the reality from their point of view. A lot of times we start with describing the problem, and that's okay, because what they're trying to do is get it out, and they're trying to formulate around what is this thing I'm experiencing. And it's also important in exploring the reality with them is to also ask them to consider the reality of others. What are the others around you experiencing? What do they need? How would they see this situation? And this we're asking our colleague, if you will, to join us in some good critical thinking. Join us in a place of, let's look at this objectively. Let's look at all the possible elements that define the reality. And oftentimes when people start here describing the problem and we get them to start thinking, it's okay to then step back and say, so what outcome would you like to create? You can start with reality and then go back to goal. What outcome? You know, what would you like to see different at the end of this? And again, you're now starting to connect the problem to them starting to problem solve. And that question naturally takes our brains into problem solving. Then we've described the reality. We know where we want to go. We've got an idea of this outcome we want to create. The next question is asking them, what options can they envision to achieve the outcome? And generally, most of us, having been thinking about things, usually have 2, maybe 3 or more ideas of options to achieve the outcome that address the full spectrum of the reality. And then ask them simply, say, which one do you think is the best one? So now we've taken them all the way down to problem solving in a context and an option to work on in order to see it a different outcome. Finally, the next question is, what's the way forward? So if that's the best option, what will you do next? What steps will you take? This is the accountability question. If we're going to be good coaches, there's always an element of accountability that asks for the timing and the actions of the next steps. So what's that way forward? This then anchors it in their mind that they have to go act on this, because just talking about it, talking about options, talking about the reality, identifying the goal, doesn't mean anything if we don't actually identify a way forward and then go act on it. So this is really an important step because this closes it out. In my experience, after having these conversations with people in my life, they usually walk away, they own it, they take action, and I generally get reported back to me the impact that that had. And they appreciated that I just listened, and that had I given them an answer, it probably would not have been as meaningful, and they would not have gotten the outcome that they really desired. And it was right for them. So I have a question for you, another poll question. So leaders in your organization, the leaders in my organization are good listeners and employ good coaching techniques to help others solve problems. Okay, 64% of us reporting. I'm going to end polling and share the results. Exciting. I mean, the fact that 48% of us feel that we have leaders and organizations that do that, and another 17% that really strongly agree. That's nice. So we've got over half, well over half of us feel like we've got leaders in our organization that do this for us. That's remarkable. The rest, obviously, we've all experienced leaders that are inclined just to give us answers. Because even if we're in the neither agree or disagree bucket, statistically speaking, that lack of assurance simply means that it probably doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist to the level that we would like it to. So here's a question. Do we believe that personality plays a role? I would say yes. At Oliver Group, we actually work in psychometric instruments. We happen to be a predictive index licensee. And I've also been exposed to hosts of other psychometric instruments over my career, all of which have given me unique insights. I call it different panels of the same beach ball. And so the idea is that what can I do to understand this other person? What can I do to make sure that I'm connecting with them in ways that are meaningful to them? So even through the lens of the GROW model, if I can understand what their needs are through some perspective, it allows me to be that much more effective in how I ask questions, how I listen. But I will tell you, independent of personality, we all like to be heard. We all like to be listened to. That's a sincere form of caring. It's a sincere form, of partnership when we ask questions and we actually listen. But I do want to do another poll. I want to ask us a question, which is, do we form judgments? Do we observe behavior and form judgments? So to what degree do we form judgments? Sorry, I'm going to relaunch that. So I have a question for you. I would like you to join me in a little exercise. Now, generally, when I'm facilitating in front of a room, I can see this happening, right? But in this setting, I'm going to ask you to literally close your eyes just for a second. And in closing your eyes, I'm going to give you a visual. And that visual is this. A person is running out of a building screaming. So if your eyes were open, fine. If not, go ahead and open your eyes. And what I would like to do is to, I left it open. My apologies. Good news though, you're still answering it for me, which I appreciate. Excellent. 64% reporting. So I'm going to end polling and I'm going to share the results. And I will tell you that these results are very common, that the vast majority of people have a vision of the building being on fire. What's really interesting is that increasingly, we tend to see, I'm saying increasingly, but I tend to see or hear from the groups we facilitate, the vast majority tend to envision this person running out of the building is female. And you see those results here. And again, not necessarily a discriminating factor, but there is something going on in our brains where this tends to be predominant, even among women. Generally, when we get the gender neutral answer, it's because people were not even focused on the individual, they were focused on what's going on behind the individual. So when we think about the building being on fire, that's the most common response. Active shooter, bomb threat, very common. And a very small percentage tend to say, hey, I won the lottery and I just told my boss to go pound sand. So it was more of an exciting or happy screaming versus some sort of threat response. This comes from a place in our brain where we form judgments. And we form judgments because our brains are designed to benchmark things. And it goes back to our primal brain. A colleague of mine calls it the lizard brain, where if you hear the twig snap, our ancestors would turn around and look to make sure it wasn't a bear following them in the woods. So the idea is that our brains are naturally wired to form judgments. So when we observe behavior, so think about even in stressful times, we observe behavior, and the idea is that we're automatically forming judgments about that person through our own lens. And we might be inclined to say things to ourselves like, I would never, act that way in that situation. I would never say something like that. I don't understand why that person is acting that way. So it's very interesting to me that even as adults, particularly under stressful situations, we can revert to our own autopilots. And we could be less aware of other person's needs, why someone else is responding the way they are. Now, there could be several reasons why that is true. So Dr. Michael Metz, provides us with a very simple model around trying to understand the other person. And if you think about our cognitive ability, our emotional ability, and our behaviors can all intersect. We know scientifically that there are behavior centers in the brain. We know we have cognitive areas in our brain, and we also know that we have emotional responses. Now, here's the interesting thing about emotions. You might have heard of emotional intelligence. And we do a lot of work in this space when we do our executive coaching, and we break apart our cognitive ability from our emotional capability from our behavioral understanding. So when you get into the psychometric tools, we can parse out and understand where these things come from. And you might have encountered people that are very emotionally intelligent. And they could be very similar personality-wise to another person who might not be very emotionally intelligent. So when you think about the capacity to act and the social responsibility around acting, you could have several things affecting or exacerbating behaviors. Cognitive ability and emotional ability could take a normal behavioral set and could either enhance or exacerbate the situation. So we don't always know with certainty if this is an emotionally driven response or is this just an autopilot behavioral response from someone who may not be very self-aware or who may be responding in an autopilot mode to a certain situation. This is a heuristic or just representative model, but we do know scientifically that as much as 47% of what we experience with each other is related to behavior. And we're all trying to figure each other out. We're all watching each other, trying to understand and form a reasonable understanding of why the person is and who they are, and how that's going to affect our ability to interact. And again, I'll ask you to reflect on, in stressful times, when we think about what are those things that we do, and do we revert to an autopilot? Do we allow our emotions to run amok? How well do we draw on our cognitive abilities for rational thinking? So, final poll. I'm just curious. I'm always curious to understand, what people have been exposed to in terms of personality assessments. So I'm going to ask you to complete this final poll. I would just love to get a sense from you of what you've been exposed to. Okay, 68% reporting. I'm going to end polling and share the results. Now, if I'm honest, I'm not too surprised. I was pleased to know that a number of our predictive index clients and colleagues might be joining us. So not too surprising to see that 72% of us have heard of that. But if you look at like Myers-Briggs, Gallup, DISC, there are others out there, the Hogan, there are a lot of different tools out there that any of us could use. And if you have access to any sort of a personality assessment, my encouragement is it's a great way to understand what someone needs, such that when we step into coaching, whether it's through the GROW model or any model, we can actually have a greater impact because we're going to be listening differently. We're going to be listening with an ear that's relevant to what that person needs. So it just sharpens, the reception on the radio that much more and allows us to be that much more effective as coaching one another. Now, final thought on coaching here. One of the things that I've have encountered or learned in my career is that when you think about the GROW model or you think about coaching, we tend to think of this as either typically from leader to subordinate. Most of the time we think about problem solving and using something like the GROW model, it's because one of our subordinates has walked in and said, hey, I've got a problem, boss, right? And as you showed with your leaders listening poll, many of us are experiencing our leaders as good listeners, good question askers. That's wonderful. In those cases where we may not be as adept, we say, okay, let's use a GROW model or something like it. But what about with bosses up? What about in larger settings? So I have found in my career that actually in like a setting of a meeting, one of the things that has worked for me is if, let's say, a problem gets presented to the group and there's a lot of discussion back and forth about possible solutions. One way to rein that conversation back in is to step back and ask the person who brought the problem forward, hey, what outcome would you like to create? Then acknowledge, well, here's some of the reality, have them answer, then here's some of the reality I think we've all shared. Are there other perspectives we need to hear around this problem? Okay, team, what options would we consider? Okay, let's decide on an option. And what's our best way forward? Who's going to own what and by when? So the GROW model can be actually applied in a group setting as well. Secondly, I found it effective in managing up. Sometimes when we're in meetings with our quote unquote bosses and we're blowing and going, we've got a lot on our plates, a lot of objectives, a lot of priorities, and there's this new idea being presented, it's common to start to resist, especially if we drop back into our own zone and we start thinking about, well, what have we got on our plate already? What am I capable of taking on? I can't see my way clear to doing this. Well, a lot of times, rather than reacting in the moment and start worrying about from my perspective, I can simply ask, and I have asked in my career, my leader, this question. So let me make sure I understand. If I'm hearing you, what I'm hearing is this is the outcome you would like to create. Gives them a chance to either validate or even tweak what it is they're thinking they want to accomplish. And then I would ask, okay, so let me make sure I understand all the circumstances around this change or around this new idea. And I engage that leader in a conversation around what's the reality. It usually leads to some options. It leads to some clarity of, is this even a priority for now? Because that engaging conversation around the reality begins to turn on the light bulbs. Because a lot of times, those of us that are in leadership roles, we're expected to drive things. We're expected to create outcomes. So if we're leading up, let's talk about the options. I mean, the reality. Then say, so what best options have come to mind for you or for us as accomplishing that outcome we've agreed to? From there, the next piece is obviously, well, if we agree it's good and we've agreed to shift some priorities around, then let's agree on our way forward. What it does is all of these steps using the GROW model allow us to get to rational thinking, de-escalate, serve and support one another, especially in stressful times, to be able to take a step back. We avoid our autopilot personalities. We help them de-escalate and step down. and we find ways to get into active problem solving. And in this, we are all coaches. We all have the capability to be coaches. So at this point, I'm going to ask that, if you have questions, I've noticed some chat responses here. I'm going to pull these up, and if you have any questions you would like to ask, I would ask that you type them into the chat box for me. So while we're waiting for any questions, there are several people that mentioned that they use multiple different assessments, and that's very common. Thank you for that. Appreciate that insight. I'll give it a couple more minutes in case anyone's typing. Okay, well, it doesn't look like you've got any questions at this point. Oh, here's a question. Do you recommend using a similar approach when coaching up? Absolutely. Thank you. That is by our colleague, Michelle. And in fact, I'll reflect back on the last part of the conversation, which is if I'm sitting and have been sitting in front of my leader or my boss in meetings. And again, this gets back to that idea of when new ideas come out in that setting, there's a natural tendency for us to feel the need to, yeah, I'll take it on. I will, I'll own that, boss, even though I feel like I got a lot going on. But there's often tension in our gut that says, I've got all these other priorities, and here's this new idea, and how do we digest and act on this new idea? And all of a sudden, we're caught up in our own wheel spinning and emotional response around what's our capability to absorb this new idea. Well, so to your question, Michelle, the opportunity then is to say back to your boss, quote unquote, hey, here's what I think I'm hearing you say. This is the outcome I think you want to try to create. Am I right? Yes. Okay. We've started talking about some of the circumstances, but are there other components to this that we need to consider, right? So now we explore around reality. That could lead to an understanding around priorities, because generally inside the reality part of the grow conversation leading up, I will ask, well, where would you see this fitting with the other priorities, either on my list or for the business? That then leads to, again, more self-discovery, more open conversation about the reality. That then lends itself into options, because even if you make it to options, it's likely there's some consensus that has been built in that prior part of the conversation around, well, we've agreed there's a couple of priorities we can set aside because this thing that we're talking about may seem to have a better business impact, and we better take a look at it together. Then you jump into options, come up with the best option, and then agree on a way forward and whatever that plan is. So Michelle, thank you. That's a good question about coaching up. So we have a question. Let me go back up here. What would the first bit of advice be for coaching a person who disrupts other people with their behavior, overreacting to stressful work situations? So thank you for that question. What comes to mind for me is, the disruption is generally somebody who's not very self-aware, or they think they have all the answers. And the challenge I've seen with that is finding the right time and place to take that person aside and ask them, hey, are you aware when you do that, the effect that you're having on others? Now, this gets into what you might call one of the crucial conversations. It takes courage, right? Because there's something at risk, right? There's something either party may want, and there's something at risk. Usually it's emotions, relationships, what have you. And so my thinking there is it's about taking that person aside and asking them, are you aware when you do this behavior, the impact you're having on others? Invite them to self-reflect. Then you could potentially use the grow model. Say, so if you wanted to create a different outcome, what would that look like? Have them describe the reality. A lot of times that reality is they may not even know they're in an autopilot reaction. They may not even be self-aware enough to know the hurt or pain they're causing on others if they're disruptive. So getting them to reflect, then helping them explore, the outcome, the reality, options, and then a way forward, you might be able to help them. Now, this goes back to my original premise. We change how people perform, or maybe we don't. That's sort of the Oliver Group mantra. Sometimes you cannot coach somebody who doesn't want to be coached. In that situation, you'd have to be ready for the fact that that person may not have an interest in you coaching them. They may not want to hear it, and they may choose to continue to be destructive. And unfortunately, we have some percentage of those people in our world. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but I can tell you that is a tough conversation, and it does take some courage. Okay, my company administers predictive assessments to new hires. How often do you recommend to retake when considering long-term employees? I could tell you that through the lens of the predictive index, the way we've looked at it historically, and I can't speak for other validated instruments, but I can tell you that because the predictive index draws out, the core hardwiring versus adaptive behaviors, you could safely run the predictive index and look at for those of us that are predictive index trained, you could look at the self-concept or the adaptive behaviors, and you could look at that every 6 to 12 months. Because from a coaching perspective, you can tell if they are widely adapting, we call it maybe standing on their heads, if they're pulling factors across the norm, if there are things going on for them that are out of sync with their normal wiring, that provides a tremendous coaching opportunity to start with self-awareness. Are they aware they're adapting? And then you could say, so if you were to create a different outcome, what would that look like, right? And then you go back into the GROW model. So yes, I would say 6 to 12 months on the PI. Again, for other instruments, for those of you that use other tools, I could not profess to know what that might look like or how they measure the two states of being. Okay. How would you start the conversation if you observe coaching is needed, but the person is not aware or has not approached you for assistance? Well, thank you, Brittany. That's very similar to the question above about the disruptive person. And again, I think it depends on, what stance you want to take. How disruptive is it? How important is it for you to have that conversation? Because again, they may not be coachable. They may not want to hear it. And the other question you have to ask is, what is your role in relation to that person? If you're their boss, okay, well, then you've got a duty to act, right? If you're a colleague, the question is, how important is the relationship? And is it a problem you can solve? Do you want to put the energy into it? So again, there's no silver bullet, but if you do find your way to engage in the conversation, I would encourage you to reflect on the GROW model. And after they're aware that there's something going on that they may not be aware of, how could you help them potentially get to a different place without being directive? And again, being a good thought partner by being a good listener. All right, we are also in healthcare. We are also healthcare and considered an essential business, but have made the decision to close our clinic temporarily for safety. We are struggling with clinical leaders and operational leaders getting on the same page about reopening to provide our services due to fear our clinical side. What recommendations would you have for us to get on the same page? Well, Russell, thank you. That's a great question. I'll preface this by saying I may not have a good answer for you. I will tell you this. I'll create a little different context. I did speak to a good friend of mine, and one of our clients is the chief medical officer for a national post-acute care hospital system. And they're very large, and they have a lot of things going on. And while they're not in the heat of the COVID crisis, they're preparing for it. And they've done all the natural protocols to protect their long-term care facilities. They're also being prepared that they may have to convert cafeterias, for example, into acute care wards for COVID-19 patients. He shared with me that outside of a crisis like COVID-19, there's a natural stressor that exists between administration and clinicians. And in his assessment of things, that is where physician burnout has been emanating. That's the start. What's happening right now, conversely, in the physician space is that it's basically, we're not getting involved in strategy. We're not getting involved in operational decisions. We're not worried about that right now because we're in crisis mode. And the physicians are actually more relaxed and happier right now because they're being allowed to do what they do best, which is to respond in the moment, respond to the crisis, respond with their skills, and be the specialists that they were trained to be. As far as your particular situation, Russell, you know, again, if you are able to get both sides to the table, and if it's in your best interest to do that, I think the question then becomes one of, well, what is our goal together as administrators and clinical? What's our goal? Is our goal to reopen, or is our goal to ensure safety by not reopening? Do we have a social obligation to remain open, right? What are the attributes and what is it that we want to achieve? Because I don't think that you would be able to come to an answer unless you really start with, can we build a consensus around where we want to go? So again, I don't know, again, like I said at the preface, I don't think I've got a good answer for you there, but I would offer a few minutes on a phone call at some point following this webinar, if I could be of assistance or we could think through some things together. It might be a little more involved than just applying the GROW model as I've outlined it here today. So again, I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's a tough one, and it's certainly situational. Okay, Katie asked a question. I'm new to the organization, 5 weeks in, and I work from home. How do I connect to new direct reports that are slow to trust at this distance? Excellent question. Well, let's go back to the personality assessments. You know, I would say number one, if you have access to that data or can gain access to some sort of assessment, any starting point is better than no starting point. What can you learn about them? What do they need? How similar are they? How similar are they to you? What do you know about yourself? Where would you understand differences in terms of how they connect? We know, for example, that through the lens of many tools, when you think about introversion versus extroversion, for example, they connect very differently and have very different needs. And then when you think about executing, some people are very risk tolerant, some are very risk averse. And so there are different attributes you would want to look into. So I'm thinking, Katie, on your behalf, the starting point might be leveraging some form of an assessment that allows you to get a handle on you and your team. Who are you? Who are they? Who are you as a group? What will you do naturally as a group? What will you not do naturally? And then you could start a conversation. In fact, I find it to be most fun when we take these instruments and we have individuals or teams sit down with one another and start comparing notes. And trust gets built because now we start acknowledging each other's needs. And it's a great foundational building block for developing trust is, who are you? Who am I? How we work best together? And let's just start the conversation together. I will also tell you, Katie, that introvert versus extrovert, getting face-to-face through Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, whatever your tool of choice, allows you to look each other in the eye as much as possible. Humans, regardless of our various types of personality wiring, we are truly designed to be in social relationships with one another. It is one of the reasons why the social distancing and the lack of gatherings for introverts and extroverts alike has been challenging, because we feel distant from one another, and that exacerbates the problem if you think about it. So the more that you get face to face, the more you can hear each other's voices, and to the extent that you can predicate those interactions on some sort of meaningful understanding of one another, I think that would give you a great first step into being able to connect differently, with your team. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. Thank you, everyone. It looks like we're having people sign off, which is fine. So we may have reached the end here. If you would like to contact us, you can either email us at olivergroup@olivergroup.com. You can call our 800 number. You can also go to our website, and there's a contact us page, which will also go to the Oliver Group email. And it'll be our pleasure to follow up. And if we can be of any assistance, please do let us know. Again, this is Tom Cox, President of the Oliver Group, wishing you all the best and hope you all stay healthy and safe. Thank you.